Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's AOP Live. First of all, I want to thank you for joining us. My name is Philip Ideson, and I'm the Managing Director here at Art of Procurement. I'm joined by Kelly Barner, my partner at Art of Procurement. Kelly, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, Phil. Glad to be here.
Now, for anybody who hasn't been to an AOP Live before, the format is it's really conversational. We will be bringing one slide on screen during the entire conversation, but it is a chat really based on a lot of the questions that we received from you during the registration process. But I always encourage you as well to answer questions as we're going through the conversation. There's a little box underneath this video where you can just tap in those questions. And actually, Kelly is going to be keeping her eyes on all the questions that come in and then bringing those into the conversation as we go through today's event. So Kelly will be on camera and giving a little bit of insight to a couple of the questions we have at the beginning, and then we'll be jumping in with your questions as we go through the conversation. So the webinar today, AOP Live, is around 50 minutes in duration, and we're going to be talking around the topic of from C-suite priority to procurement strategy, managing risk at scale. That's something that I'm really passionate about. I've spent a lot of time in the risk management space, so really interested in today's conversation. And really the kind of supporting information for today's webinar is an Economist Impact report. So according to a 2022 research conducted by Economist Impact, 38% of C-suite executives view risk reduction as a way to deliver increased value through procurement. But what about that other 62%? Do they recognize the role that procurement plays in risk management? We're going to be talking about that with our two guests. So we're going to be joined by Gordon Donovan. Gordon is Global Market Research Director for Procurement and External Workforce at SAP, and also Matt Montgomery. Matt is a Solution Management Director of Supplier Lifecycle and Third-Party Risk Management at SAP. So with that being said, let's go into the conversation. And first of all, Gordon and Matt, I want to welcome you to the AOP Live stage. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Now, Gordon, I'm going to start with you because it's 1 a.m. in the morning where you are, so we need to make sure that we keep this lively. The question that I always ask at the start of these conversations, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
You know, I think I'm probably one of the small number who went and found procurement. Mm-hmm. So my father was sales director, sales manager for a whole series of organizations around advertising. Think Mad Men, only probably slightly less alcohol, I would suggest. And he used to complain a lot about buyers. And he used to complain a lot about people in purchasing, as it was called then. And I went, well, in the same way that I support the opposite team than he did. I thought, you know what, I'm going to go the opposite way on that as well. I'm going to do something completely different. You know, it's always good to be the youngest in the family because that way you get to be the one who basically does something completely different. So I went out and saw that and got a role in the UK in the 1980s. There was a scheme called the Youth Training Scheme, and I got a role at Manchester Airport. Duty free and duty paid, and was day one in a warehouse and was utterly hooked.
Matt, same question for you. How did you find yourself in procurement?
Yeah, I did not plan on being in procurement at all. I grew up in IT. My dad was a computer science college professor. I grew up programming, and that was the way I went. And I'd gotten into project management, and I was consulting for a company and was in between projects, and this big Army Ranger, West Point grad director who had also left IT and gone over to help with procurement said, what are you doing? And I was sort of taken aback and a little nervous. And I said, what do you need? And he pulled me in to help with some system deployments, which turned out to be, Ariba. And so one of my first jobs was not knowing much about procurement to go teach in China, which is not a language I speak, about a procurement solution that until I got on the plane, I didn't have access to the system. So I followed that up with a trip to Bogota. I don't speak Spanish. So, I mean, there was a lot of just learning and trial by fire there. And it's been 20 years, though, and I love it.
You're training by the language.
Let's say the language of procurement is universal, my friend.
Yes, there we go.
Now, in your job title, you had supplier lifecycle management and third-party risk management. What does the lifecycle piece mean?
For when we talk about a supplier's relationship with a customer, I mean, it starts at how do you decide what suppliers to work with, and then as you get through that process of maturing that relationship, so maybe they're interesting enough or they have the capabilities to be included for consideration. As that evolves and you decide that you do want to work with them, you take them through the contracting process, all the way through to engaging and collaborating with them and transacting, but also a recognition at the end of the process that you will need to potentially offboard them. And what does that mean? How do we transition to an alternative? Is that an area of the business that we're stopping? How do we think through that so it just doesn't fall at the end? And then all the way through that process, making sure that they're maintaining their performance to your standards and needs, doing all the necessary risk monitoring, and as they are probably trying to grow their business, they try to land and expand with you. What are the new implications of that relationship throughout? So just trying to make sure that we measure from the idea of working with the supplier all the way to the end.
And so you're looking at risk then across that entire continuum and all the different points that risk is present, and then we need to think about it along that life cycle.
That's right.
Now, Gordon, from your role, your job title perspective, you have both procurement and external services. Does the way you think about risk differ from an external services perspective than it does a procurement perspective?
From an external workforce perspective? Yeah, I mean, I think... Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things here. From an external workforce perspective, using external workforce as a way to manage risk has come up as a pretty big reason why organizations actually use external workforce in the first place. And that could be that, I think what we've seen over the last few years is it's been tough to get labor, and then it's been tough to find skilled labor. I think those are the two things that have come through. And I think at the same time, we've seen over the last few years, organizations go through some pretty radical transformations over the last few years because they've had to.
Yeah.
And we've seen, this mass sort of migration to digital. And what that has meant is that I think the skill sets of people haven't necessarily kept pace with the change of organizations. So they've got these big skills gaps. And, we can't all be like Matt and being able to jump onto a plane and to train people in a language that you don't speak on a system that you've never known before. So I think that those skill sets of people haven't yet kept pace. There was a PwC research report recently that identified if people were happy or not with their transformations. This wasn't specific to procurement. It was much more broader from an organization's perspective. And of those that weren't, the major reason that they gave was that the organizations didn't actually have the skills to take advantage of the new technology. So I think we're seeing that a lot. I think the second sort of area from a external workforce perspective is this whole insourcing, outsourcing. And I think organizations are kind of rethinking a little bit as to what is core for their organization. Because essentially the last 3 years has been a big test of every organization's contingency plans. Many of them have failed because what they thought was core wasn't core, and what they thought was non-core was actually core. I mean, I think any organization that sells a product to a consumer is probably thinking now, is 3PL, is third-party logistics, actually, should that be first-party logistics? Should I be doing that myself, the last mile to the customer? So I think all of those things are kind of coming up now to start thinking, to have organizations thinking about how do I use external workforce as a way to manage risk.
Interesting. And on that outsource versus insource, then, what we see is you then rethinking. So I think when you traditionally, as you thought about this in the context of risk and outsourcing, you looked at the contract as being your protection. And so, okay, so I've contracted with somebody, they've got all these penalties or KPIs or whatever it may be in a contract, and so I'm good to go. As opposed to the realization now that you've got to be a lot more involved, knowledgeable about the different tiers within that supply chain, so you can actually proactively manage, not just, okay, I've outsourced it to somebody, and if there's a problem, and a term that maybe not the best term, but a lot of people use, they're the throat to choke. The reality is you've actually got to go and observe more deeply.
I think the supply chain visibility piece. So there was it the Deloitte CPO report from 2019, I think it was, possibly 2020, said that only 10% of organizations had visibility beyond tier 1 in their supply chain. There was a Deloitte and SIPS report from 2022 that said 70% didn't have visibility beyond tier 2. Now that's progress, right? From 10% not beyond tier 1 to 70%. So that's a whole tier. The problem is that most issues happen around tier 4 or tier 5 in supply chains that go that deep. So you've got to have that visibility into that tier. And I think the other area that organizations have, I don't know if realized, but I think it's moved up people's kind of awareness scale, is the relationships with the suppliers. And you mentioned around, the contract was the thing.
Yeah.
The contract's not going to save you when it all goes horribly wrong. It's the relationship that's going to save you. I was on a roundtable with a CPO of a large consumer products, and they thought that they were dual sourcing a very key component, and they weren't. And he turned around and said, well, we thought we were, and then we started digging a little bit deeper. And I think it was like 3 tiers down or 4 tiers down the supply chain. No, we weren't. We were single sourcing. And it was only the relationship. And this was a key product that they were, as part of their manufacturing cycle. They said it was the only relationship that saved us. And it basically came out that his advice was, it's quite simple. You either multi-source, or if you're going to single source, you have to be at the front of the queue. You have to be. We are the customer that you supply to when you can only supply to one. And I used to say to my category managers the same thing. When you're looking at that, if they can only supply to one customer, is that you? And if it's not you, then what are we going to do?
Yeah. We always talk about the contract being, if you have to refer to the contract, then you've already kind of in a losing situation, because that means that you don't have the relationship to support. Now, I'm going to bring, we did a mini poll on LinkedIn around this topic of risk before the webinar. And for anybody who's listening to this as a podcast rather than watching, I'm going to just read this out. The question was, what is the most important way that procurement can contribute to company-wide risk management efforts? And we gave 4 choices, as is the ability in LinkedIn to do that. And the 4 choices in order of responses was proactive risk monitoring came in number 1 at 34%. Supplier performance management came in at 32%. Supply chain visibility came in at 24%. And building mitigation strategies came in last at 10%. Matt, what are your immediate thoughts as you look at some of those numbers of how folks responded to that question?
Yeah, and I think that's very logical. The risk monitoring, just so that you're not, you're going to be surprised, but how ahead of that surprise, or how early in that process can you get as being number 1? But I think supplier performance management being such a close second is really interesting. There are times when you look backwards at an event and you start to recognize that you probably knew it was going to happen before it did. And I mean, take natural disasters or invasions or tsunamis out of the picture there, but that idea that supplier was giving a lot of indicators, I think is right there. So, as I look at those being so close together, and I'm sure if you continue to keep that open and run it over time, they'd go back and forth as to which one was number 1. But yeah, that's my immediate reaction. Is just that it's so important to be very aware of what that supplier is doing, how they're performing. Are they starting to give, be much more sensitive to timely payments? Are they asking for, different things that are a little unusual? Are you starting to see them transition resources in and out? I mean, all of those things that are leading indicators to there being a problem are important.
And Kelly, as you looked at this, was there anything that surprised you from these results?
Well, interesting. I don't know if it's so much about surprise as it is, I have in my head now something we were discussing with Gordon and Matt before the event went live today. And we were talking about some commentary on risk back from 2004. So right now we have this very unique relationship with risk, I feel like, in procurement and supply chain, because we're all survivors of the last 3 years. But the reality is, when you lengthen the frame of time that we look at, and even for the four of us here, looking over the course of our careers, it never really goes away. And so it's more about our mindset towards risk and how likely we think it is in any specific case versus broadly across all of our categories. Probably that 10% around building mitigation strategies is an indication that while risk is top of mind right now, it's not necessarily top of the priority list when it comes to taking action and doing things. And so that sort of emotional response we have to our assessment of risk at any point, we think of ourselves as being in the midst of risk right now, and yet human psyche has a way of sort of lulling ourselves into wanting to go back to a kind of status quo. So it'll be interesting, to Matt's point, if we were to keep taking little benchmarks of these same options, how would things change? At one point, is the psyche of procurement and supply chain truly going to relax, when in fact we should try to maintain the level of visibility and effort and focus on this that we have right now?
The building mitigation strategies at 10% surprised me that was so low at the bottom. I think that may have been my vote. Because, as Matt said, you kind of have you have a good sense that something is going to happen. And it's not necessarily, if you do some scenario analysis, you can pretty much come up with some good scenarios that are going to touch the products or services that are going to be most impacted. And so I just look at building mitigation strategies as being really proactive, regardless of whether you're monitoring whether a flood is going to hit Chennai, next week because of weather alerts. At that point, you're probably too late to do anything about it anyway. So what are the things that are the most important to you, and get mitigation strategies in place at a category level, not just a supplier level first. But Gordon, anything from your perspective as you look at those results?
I mean, I agree with you in saying I was a little surprised to seeing that the mitigation strategy is so low. And there was an article that came out yesterday from Harvard Business Review, and it was all about scenario planning and what happens when scenario plans fail, which was interesting. And essentially, the crux of the article was they fail when they're too narrow. And where they failed over the last couple of years is because the breadth of the different what-if scenarios hasn't been considered to start thinking about the mitigation strategies. And linking back to this article from 2004, they were saying exactly the same thing, is organizations, they define agility as being able to respond at speed to events that happen because they've built good, strong mitigation strategies. And I think what's happened over the last few years is that the breadth of what those scenario plans need to consider to start building has certainly broadened. But again, as Kelly said, I think I read out a piece from that particular article, and it was like, it could have been written yesterday, but it was written in 2004.
Yeah, like word for word. Now, you've done a lot of research around CEOs, chief supply chain officers, CFOs, so non-procurement executives. Do you think the CEO would agree with how procurement responded to that question?
I think CEOs would put supply performance at number one. I think some research that I've been doing, and it's going to come out later this year, the whole supply performance, supply relationships has rocketed up the CEO's agenda from a sort of procurement risk. And I think if we think about the risks that CEOs actually think about, the number one risk that CEOs think about is cyber. To be honest, there was a specific risk PwC survey that came out, and their number one, pretty much across all the C-suite, not just CEOs but CFOs and COOs, was cybersecurity. That was their number one organizational risk. From a procurement perspective, it is that supplier risk. It's supply chain clarity, getting better visibility into the supply chain, who actually supplies them, and who supplies them. Their suppliers. There's a whole Monty Python sketch we can go into within that as well if we like to. And I think that's the biggest thing that they think about. And I think the second thing, we've touched on it with this insourcing, outsourcing, is the operating model changes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's on their that's absolutely front of mind now for them, is to go, what's the best way that we actually need to deliver the things that we're doing now for our customers? Do we do it ourselves? Do we rely on the supply chain? What if? And I think those are the things that are really coming. Because the last 3 years, massively tested supply chains, and it's exposed where organizations were underprepared.
Mm-hmm. So Matt, when
you're supply performance a little bit higher,
I wanted to pull that kind of across to essentially from the CEO's perspective and what you're seeing in the research to what, Matt, you're seeing when you're speaking to CPOs, when you're going through kind of the solutioning process. Are you hearing CPOs talking about cyber security risk, for example, as something to monitor and to protect against, or at least measure against?
Definitely. I mean, and that's one that crosses all industries, I feel,
Mm-hmm.
where some of the other risks, the financial or the regulatory or the environmental risks, I mean, are more or less sensitive, but everybody's asking about cyber risk and how do we monitor that? And what does that even mean to them?
Yeah.
Is it that they're making sure that the supplier doesn't have a breach? Does the supplier have access to their systems in some way? Or does, and if they have access to their systems, what controls do they have in place? There's just a lot of just nervousness. And I think that's such a misunderstood or not understood sort of activity, that how do you protect, and it evolves so quickly. I mean, we know what an earthquake is. It's a horrible thing.
Mm-hmm.
We know what flooding is. It's a horrible thing. But cybersecurity, what does that even mean? And how do I protect myself? I think a lot of people are just very fearful of it. So it is in every conversation.
As you think about how to protect against that, is there a commonly accepted best practice as you think about integrating the I don't necessarily mean mitigation, but it's I think part of the confusion comes from what do you do about it? Because can you proactively mitigate against cybersecurity risk? So how do you kind of advise folks as they're worried about this, about how they could be thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a process that they go through that is just one of those logical, like if somebody asked you after the fact if something went wrong, did you do this? And you were going to be really embarrassed that you said no. So if you ask the question, do they have access to our systems? And that first question then drives a lot of things. And if they do, what is their physical security? What background checks do they do of their employees, or what sort of controls are in place to sort of manage access on their side? What access do they have? How do we gate that access? I mean, you start going down this list of good questions that you need to ask then if they do have access. And so a lot of it too is we look at this is how there could be a lot of questions, and there could be a lot of suppliers that you answer yes to. So it also becomes a optimization effort of making sure that you're not you're asking all of the right questions as you go through this. You're doing this on a regular basis, but you're optimizing that so that the reviewers aren't just so overwhelmed that they're just checking the box. Mm-hmm. That there is sort of that ability to make sure that we're not asking questions that aren't relevant for that situation, so that the reviewers can really focus and know what it is. And then according to the risk profile, have the right recurrence of that validation that this is still live and real, and they're still maintaining that level, that standard that you need them to uphold.
Kelly, I'm going to just come over to you briefly to see if we've had any questions in from the audience to pose to Matt or Gordon so far.
So we do have a couple of questions that come in, and this actually follows very closely on what we were just talking about. If cyber risk is the CEO's top concern, should procurement be working to understand end-tier supply chain cybersecurity, right? So we talked, Gordon, you shared that, 10% of organizations had visibility beyond the first tier, and then some number of years later had moved up and that had increased to looking at second tier. But part of what prevents us from doing that is that it seems like an overwhelming task. But if we were just to focus on one thing and that one thing happened to be the one thing that the CEO cares about most, it would be a place to start, right? Can we just look at how tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and beyond are managing cybersecurity?
My view on this is getting visibility into end tier is the silver bullet that makes procurement every organization's hero or heroine. Because everything happens in the supply chain. Cost optimization happens in the supply chain. You want to take cost out, not price negotiation, but physical cost out. It's going to happen somewhere in the supply chain. You want to find where your scope 3 emissions are, happens in your supply chain. You want to find where the cyber is, it happens in your supply chain. It's happening at the 3rd and 4th tier. Toyota, I think it was Toyota in, I want to say it was 22. It might have been 21. But their 14 manufacturing sites went down because of something that happened in their 3rd tier vendor. And they were up and running again in about, I think it was 24, 36 hours, Matt. I don't know if you remember that, but they were up and running again pretty quickly. And, you know, the hackers that are targeting these people, they're not, you know, they're pretty clever.
Yeah.
And they're going to target the vulnerable ones.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's incredibly important that as part of your supplier risk mechanism is to understand how organizations themselves are dealing with it, and then what checks they're doing on their supply chain and getting involved in that. I mean, I was chatting to a CPO of a telecoms company. He was saying they were getting involved in 4th, 5th, 6th tier discussions because they were feeling they were having to now to get into those levels of discussions, not exclusively around cyber, but I think that one of the big things from a procurement professional now is I would be desperately trying to understand who's in my supply chain from a broad, just from a logistics risk perspective, from a geopolitical risks perspective. There was a CPO saying to me that the tail end spend used to be an aggregate play. You know, you would turn around and try and push them all together, put them to one supplier. Sure, we know few of those organizations, and then buy from those. But then that's actually exposing them to a whole bunch of risk that they now can't see as going into their supply chain. So yes, the answer for me, the answer to that question is I'd be spending all the time that I could possibly spend. I'm not just saying this because I work for a technology company. I'd be automating as much as I possibly can out of everything else because I want to spend my time understanding what's happening in my supply chains, and then start thinking about the risk opportunities, the cost saving opportunities. You know, it's my old boss used to call it's the day job, and I think the cost management opportunities now for procurement are in the 3rd, 4th tier. It's stuff that we got trained in back in the day: value analysis, value engineering. Can I substitute that product? Can I change the way that we do this? And we know that, you know, from a geographical perspective, more risks happen in certain areas of the world than other areas of the world.
Yeah.
And especially if we're, you know, concerned with modern slavery, we have to know where they are in that supply chain. So that would be my answer.
And Matt, a slightly different way of looking at this same topic. Stereotypically, procurement gets a hard time for talking like procurement. So there's what we say, there's the information that we have available to us to answer the CEO's questions, to address C-suite concerns. But then there's how we talk about it. Is there a way that procurement can prepare themselves so that when that moment, it's really an opportunity to play an incredibly important role within the organization, that moment comes, should we be thinking about what language we use, how we address these topics, so that when we speak about risk, we're not speaking like procurement talking to the C-suite, we're speaking like a team of people that truly understand how our data, how our value, how our perspective aligns with what the business as a whole is trying to achieve?
Yeah, I love this question, and it is hard. I mean, a lot of times if we're focused on savings or we're focused on efficiency or time to delivery, I mean, those are important metrics. But I think as we raise that conversation up to talk to the C-suite, there's a lot more about, let's talk more revenue impact, customer outages, that sort of language in terms of what that means. So being able to sort of flip that conversation to be able to understand, it's not that there is a risk and this is a critical supplier. It's, what products is that involved with? What is how do I tie that to the revenue impact? How long will it take us to recover? And then what's the revenue impact? What customer contracts are at risk? What's the business impact of what it is, not just the impact itself. So, getting a little bit better at speaking in financial terms is just a key skill to develop.
And we have access to that information. Part of it is us being conscious of it and being prepared to come in and address the same issues, but in that context, absolutely. All right, so Phil, I'm going to pass back to you. I actually saw a flurry of questions come in as we were discussing, so I'm going to go check those out, and I will hand it back to you.
All right, thank you, Kelly. And one thing I just wanted to make a point, something you said, Gordon, around that end-tier visibility. People often ask, well, how do you do that? And at the core, it goes back to that relationship management. Because if you go to contracts, it's like, I'm not going to tell you that's my IP. How I construct my supply chain and everything within my supply chain is my IP, because I don't want you to go and start unlocking it and building it for yourself, or going and telling my competitor how I do it. You're only going to get that through trust. Once you get the trust, then you can layer on the technology to enable it. But you need that trust and that supplier relationship to be able to actually even think about getting even below, the first tier of visibility.
Yeah, we've been doing some research with the University of Tennessee specifically about trust in supply, buyer-supplier trust. What generates trust? What disintegrates trust? And that's all based on certain types of relational contracting and the way that organizations do it. Because you think about it, when you go to market. If you're going to go to market for a product, you're basically saying to the supplier, what you've been doing before isn't good enough, because I'm going to go and see if someone else is there. Mm-hmm. That might not be what you mean, but that's the message that's been received. So we've got to think about how we interact with the suppliers at all the points and I think it comes back to thinking about things in terms of supply rather than supplier. Not denigrating supplier, it's incredibly important, but I think supply risk and supply management is interesting, just to have that kind of concept in your heads.
Yeah, I always think about you need to look at supply risk before supplier risk. Suppliers are just a layer of potential risk that you either add or that helps you mitigate against the supply risk that you have. But ultimately, it's really the inherent risk with what you're buying that's the thing to focus on. At least to focus on first.
Yeah. Phil, that's an interesting point for me. I've been arguing a little bit with folks that want to talk to me about supplier risk. I mean, because that's my title, that's what we do, right, as it kind of goes. But it's the context that's missing if we don't do that correctly. So what if the supplier is higher risk? Where does that show up in my supply chain? What is the impact of that, as we were just saying? What does it mean, and where is it shared across the organization, that activity? So supply risk is much more important than supplier risk.
Yeah, I think some of that is because, at least from my personal experience, we were conditioned, and this is coming out of the automotive industry, to think about risk as being financial health. And so we wouldn't necessarily differentiate what a provider would do. We would just go and run run typical credit bureau, credit agency checks against 4,000 suppliers and say, well, the financial risk for these 20 looks the highest, so those are the ones we should focus on. And that was our entire purview of what risk meant. And so you kind of come up with that perspective. Thinking about it from a supply rather than a supplier is just a 180-degree shift to how we were brought up to think about risk.
We started getting into software. Sorry to interrupt, Gordon. We started getting into software, and so one of our criteria for looking at a supplier working with that activity, as you said, was financial. For us, it was spend amount. Well, we were in software, and we were using some open source software which had a zero cost, so that would never show up. But it was security software. So if something went wrong, that was horrendous. That was in all of our products. So what does that mean? So it can't just be just a number. You have to really understand that supplier.
And I think if you go back to the oldest procurement tool set that there is, and you can either call it CRY-X matrix or you can call it supply positioning, depending on who taught you. It tells you to position supply. And one of the axes is about risk. And so therefore you've got to understand the risk of the supply. And I think what I've seen is a lot of people putting suppliers in there. And it's like, oh, no, that's just that supplier risk. Yes, that's a problem, but you could choose another supplier, and that would be something different. You need to think about the supply, and it all comes back to knowing how to use those things properly. There's a reason why they're still being used now, even though they were brought out in 1983.
Yeah,
which was actually before even I started in procurement. There you go. I was 88, so that's me.
So I want to move on to another topic in a second, but I did want to just tie in when we talked about inherent risk and the categories. So supply, and categories and subcategories as opposed to suppliers. Is there a difference in how we think about inherent risk if it's a company that has a physical supply chain versus having a virtual supply chain? And what I mean by that is traditionally bucketed as being product versus service related risk. Gordon?
I mean, I think if you think about, for me, no, risk is risk. Certain suppliers present, as we just talked about, present higher risks than others. But when you think about a product, there's actually services attached to that because someone's got to make it, which is labor. Labor's a service. Yeah. So you got to think about there's always a service element to any good that you're buying. So the difference between, for me, is the goods and services. In many ways, there might be more risks around the services than there are the good. I mean, the commodity in the good there is much more information about that commodity that's probably more available than anything. If you look at any of the sort of trading platform, I look at I look at transaction economics every day. And I look at various commodities in there, and I look at various forecasts because, again, I refer you to my earlier answer. And it's harder to a degree to look at the services side of things. But in many ways, that makes it an easier risk thing from a question perspective because you've got a whole bunch of questions. Once you've got data, it's really hard to question that data. Whereas when you don't have data, you sort of build it up yourself. So is there a difference? I think risk is risk. And I think the danger of looking at goods without understanding the services that go with that goods, that for me is probably the biggest risk, if you like, of that.
Yeah, I think it's oftentimes we see that folks who buy services think that risk management doesn't apply to me because they can't see the supply chain.
It does. Yeah.
And so that's where, in our training around risk management, we talk a lot about the fact that it's just as relevant. In fact, even more so sometimes because the tiers of supply are less visible when you're buying a service than they are when you can kind of figure out these are the bits that go into building a widget, which goes into building a final assembly. It's a little bit harder and more nuanced to figure out these are the things that go into providing a service, and so you're even more blind to what the risks are that within that supply chain.
It's interesting, Phil. When I used to run training programs, one of the things we used to was teach people is how to build a should cost model. And in many ways, it's easier to build a should cost model for a service than it is for a good, because 80% of the cost in a should cost model is labor. And it's, back in the days before a pretty good search engine became available, we had a telephone book and a telephone, and you phone up 5 or 6 different recruiters and find out the price for those various people and start doing maths. So sorry, Matt, I interrupted, buddy.
Oh, no. I was just going to agree. I think that as you were already saying, the leading indicators that something is going wrong, whether it's quality or delivery, I mean, whatever that is easier with a commodity. I think on the service, because it isn't as visible and we don't ask as many questions, you do have to approach it very differently. And I think, when I started in as a project managed institute PMP kind of person with waterfall project management, I mean, we had these big gaps of time between the sort of the definition of what a problem was and the delivery of that. Agile methodologies has helped us make those a little bit shorter term to where we can course correct more quickly as we look at different services activities. But that, if you think about that from a risk perspective of, if I don't have the same visibility to, it's stuck at a port somewhere, or, that this isn't, I've had some quality issues, so I need to go address those. If you don't have those same sort of indicators, just try to be creative about that service and think about, how do I start to shorten the time to identify that things are not going well so that I can go course correct?
Yeah, react faster.
Yes.
Matt, you see a lot of procurement organizations at different stages of maturity in terms of their investment in their ability to handle risk. What kind of investments do you see as people are thinking about, okay, I need to get a better handle on my risk? I do everything manually. I don't really know what I don't know. Where should we start? Is it process? Is it skills? Is it technology? Like how do you start thinking about this as a puzzle to solve for?
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I think where to start is it may be in the beginning that what you really need to make sure that you're doing is considering risk as a input to the decisions that you're making. So some of the larger companies will have a whole team that define what risk means, and they'll go through and weight all sorts of different data sources, and they've bought all of these subscriptions and they're doing all of that. But that linkage then to make sure that it's embedded in the decisions you're making. So is probably most important and where I would start. So even if I didn't have a good clear picture, align with a trusted resource to go have risk information sort of help you be informed in that decision. But make sure that as we're looking at like a purchase requisition, that what is that supplier's risk profile as you've defined it very quickly. Let's make sure that's there. Let's make sure that in a sourcing event that they are you're not putting yourself in a bad position, and you can do the evaluation, and then I think you can start to get out of a little bit of trouble and build from there.
As you think about the continuum, Matt, we talked about the life cycle at the beginning. Like, is there a place in that continuum where technology is the most impactful? Or is it kind of more nuanced to answer than that, because you're using technology in different ways at different parts of the life cycle?
Yeah, I like that question a lot. I think what happens is that there are risk experts and there are procurement experts, and then there is the absolute rest of the business that's just trying to get something done. And so the farther you get away from that sort of core risk team or even that core sourcing team, for activities, that's when I think you really need to automate and embed in system decisions and system automation, that risk knowledge, that risk decision, because the general business user is not focused on the risk profile. They're trying to solve that need, immediate to that activity. So that's where I think as we look at, like at a business, the supply chain professionals, that's what they do every day. When we look a little farther out, that is not what they're thinking about. They're not thinking about cybersecurity. They're thinking about this marketing campaign. They're not thinking about cybersecurity as much as they're just thinking about how do I solve my human resource needs or whatever that is. So that would be where I would want to make sure that we're embedding the decision support naturally in that process.
So, Kelly, I'm going to come back to you just to ask. I know that we said at the top that it was going to run about 45 minutes. I'm going to take just a few more minutes, predominantly to keep Gordon awake for a little bit longer in Melbourne. But wanted to come back to you, Kelly, if there's any other questions that have come in from the audience before I got the last couple that I have here.
There are actually. So this first question that I'm going to pull up, Corey asks, how can procurement communicate to the C-suite that the risk management program is working? So Gordon, let me come to you for that first. We've talked about cyber risk, we've talked about labor strikes, we've talked about hurricanes, we've talked about geopolitical instability. Some of these things are a little bit more predictable than others. How is procurement supposed to A, know, and B, communicate with the C-suite about how effective the current risk management program is?
So it's an interesting question.
It's a great question.
Yeah. I'm so glad you came to me first with that. What I would say is, I remember someone smart on this call, that's not me, turned around and said it was really hard to prove something that doesn't happen. So my first bit would be, is there some kind of measure of an event that doesn't happen would be the first thing. I love measuring things. CPO once told me that, and he was in the food industry, and he said that they budgeted for 5 events that would have to pull a line from the shelves every year. And he goes, if you can make it 4, means that the risk management program is working. Yeah. And they ascribed a number to it, and the number was $1 million. Because every time we've got to pull something from the shelves, it costs us $1 million. Again, I don't know how they got to that number. I didn't go in too deep. So measures would be the first thing. I think you're going to be looking back to see how frequently certain things happen, and if you can reduce those and then start to measure the impact of those reduced ones, that is absolutely one that you can start to do. I think, and Matt hit on this before, by understanding the criticality and the risk of the thing that you're buying in the first place, and linking that risk and criticality to the levels of effort that you're going into. Because most people in businesses just want to get the stuff that they want to get done. So we have to kind of balance, I think, the risk process and the level of engagement that we need to have with the ability to ensure that people get things done in a way that still manages the sort of risk management piece from our side. And I think the key to that is getting engaged all the way off camera, all the way at the beginning, because it's really hard. I think this was in the gentleman from Gilead Life Sciences. I was listening to his podcast with you, Phil,
Brian Peters.
Days ago. Yeah, and he was saying about he's writing. I'm interested in reading this paper when he writes it. Trying to get the sabermetrics together of when we get engaged earlier in the piece versus get engaged later in the piece, and actually showing the differences in the value that we produce. We can show those values and ascribe that measure to what a reduced risk is. That I think is the key. And to something that Matt was saying, talking about speaking in the C-suite language. Every C-suite's got their own language. Corey, his organization will have a language that they speak, that they generally run measures on, whether that's a revenue number, whether that's and typically if you want to speak C-suite, it's revenue, not cost saving. How has this contributed to the organization defending or increasing its revenue? Those would be the key things. I think not many organizations have cost cut their way to success.
Yeah, I want to jump in there just for 1 second, Gordon, because I wrote down revenue protection as a metric, because we had, and I forget who we had a podcast with recently that was talking about, that was one of the ways that they demonstrated value through all the supply chain issues, was essentially demonstrating that we protected so much revenue by protecting against risk events occurring, or whatever that may be. So that could be an interesting way of, you set a goal of how much revenue you want to protect through risk mitigation efforts, and that could be a way of tracking against it.
And we did something in healthcare when I was a CPO of a healthcare company. And whenever we were writing a business case for a capital perspective, largely it was revenue defense. So it was private healthcare, so there's a revenue aspect to it. Because it was a case of this doctor said this doctor brings this amount of revenue in, the risk of this doctor going is this is how we're going to replace it. Therefore, this bit here is a risk mitigation thing. And it comes back to, in that case, it was revenue defense rather than revenue enhancement. But I think the two are really good measures.
And as we talk about measures, Matt, if I can ask one more question here, given our time. First of all, if you're dealing with risk, it always helps to be lucky. And Lucky asks, how do you manage a contract from the perspective of a project being completed on time and on budget? And I think the piece of this that jumps out at me, given all the other things we've discussed, is this idea of time. Procurement does think in terms of cost, of spend, of maybe number of suppliers, what's known, what's unknown tiers. But the element of time is also something that can be tracked. And whether it's how long it takes us to achieve something, or how long the time is between a disruption occurring and us having some kind of solution to put in place, I imagine that would be an idea that would resonate with the C-suite, even though it's a little bit abstract. Is response time, elapsed time, are these kinds of things coming up in the conversations that you're having around the speed of the procurement organization and their ability to manage supply chain disruption relatively quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes to the question of speaking to the C-suite, that time to value, the time to see the benefit of what it is, and depending on what this is, there's a different level of criticality. If this is supporting a product launch and there's dates associated with it that have been made public, you've got to hit this date. What does that mean?
Yeah.
And as you look at time, as that becomes challenged, you start giving up scope or quality sometimes just to hit that number. I think that becomes really tough. But at the beginning, I think a lot of it is scope management, being able to define the scope clearly and being able to check in and make sure that we're making progress. And back I'm old, but the earn value sort of approach to project management, being able to see the value of what has already been accomplished as your measure of progress, not that the calendar time has progressed, I think is really important. So so if I look at a contract and I set that up, that there are frequent milestones and frequent checkpoints, and there is buffer time in the contract to course correct if a milestone is off. I think that's how I would tend to manage. But I also think as you look at that time frame, is just making sure that you've managed the scope and you've given yourself enough time for everyone to be successful, and it's very clearly communicated as early as possible as things are missing, what that impact is, and how we can be how we can mutually agree between the supplier or all parties how we're going to go course correct and get it back on time, especially if time, like for a product launch or something, is your most important aspect.
I think time is one of those interesting things to address because we all have perspectives on it. Yes, we can measure hours, days, weeks, months, but our perception of speed is going to be different from person to person. So it can probably lead to some very interesting conversations internally.
Yeah, and from my perspective, speed is a risk, right? The speed of the process is a risk organizationally. We're talking about risks today, and we're thinking about risks from an external-facing perspective. But when you think about risks from an internal, the ability to move quickly through processes is an internal risk to be able to respond to anything, whether it's product development, whether it's unfolding risks that are occurring and how can we respond to it. That's really critical.
Yeah, and the absolute worst thing that happens, and I mean, it's very logical, right? But you develop something and then you test and validate it. And so if you're running out of time, you shrink the time to test and validate. And that is just, that's just setting up for disaster. So, that test and validation time frame needs to absolutely be locked in, and that's immovable. It's the development time getting up to that point, and thinking about the start of test as being your product launch date, potentially. That's the most important thing.
Now, we've got lots of other questions that I could possibly ask. I guess I'm going to ask this in 2 minutes, Gordon. I'm going to put you on the spot, and then we're going to wrap up. We have a question that came in from Pauline in advance, and I think it's tied to what you were talking about earlier about early engagement in the process. Pauline asks, how have you seen companies approach supplier segmentation aside from the amount of spend, but taking into account financial, ethics, privacy, cybersecurity risks? So taking that assessing risk at a supplier level that takes a bigger picture view than just how much money we spend with them.
I mean, sure thinking, I'll jump in. How about that?
You go.
I think that the most important thing to look at that, and you could talk about region, you could talk about industry as being the most, but you need to look for like and be able to anticipate or see the unusual. So that's just what I would say. If you've got 10 companies doing the same thing and one of them is starting to become an outlier, that's where you need to go focus. So that segmentation, it's not unusual for a lot of debt to show up like in the construction or where there's a big capital outlay in those industries. That might be very unusual in a services industry, right? So you just need to look for what's unusual and be able to look at like for like. Sorry, Gordon. Yeah, I was giving you time to think.
Yeah, well, I think the other area to consider is how if we're looking at a specific supplier risk as opposed to supply risk, I would factor in how the supplier views you as a customer. I think that gets missed off way too much, because I think we think that the supplier must love us because, of course, they say, "Oh no, you're a great supplier, you're a great customer, love you." I think we need to take an objective look at that a little bit and say, are we really aligned as a buyer seller? I mean, we've talked about, or I've mentioned a bit around the importance of supplier relationships, that's the thing that's going to get you out of it all when it all goes horribly wrong, and the need to ensure that supplier is going to supply to you. We really need to understand how important a customer you are, and how much of a favorite customer you are. There was a great piece of research that was done that I saw that something like 73% of suppliers, it's a bit like 27% of statistics are made up on the spot, but 73% of suppliers said that they would go the extra mile for not their most important customer, but their favorite customer.
Right.
And that number was higher for favorite than it was important.
Mm-hmm.
So just think about that for a minute. There's a delta between most important and favorite customer. Yeah. So for me, the bit that I would be really focusing on is, have I got the right relationship with this supplier? And if I haven't got the right relationship with the supplier, how am I going to get the relationship that I need? Can I get the relationship that I need? Or actually, do I need to change the source of supply? Mm-hmm. I think your ex-automotive, I was reading, Toyota regularly changed suppliers because they'd reached the ceiling with them. We can't get any better. But the ceiling on the other supplier that's out there is a lot higher, even though we're going to go down in level of performance because the ceiling is higher.
Short term, right.
We've got to think
continuous improvement.
Yep. There's a phrase there about that, so I'm sure I read that.
And I would just add, first of all, think about when we go back to the inherent risk, should you even care about your supplier risk? And, assuming this is how we think about doing it at scale, and then assuming that you should care about the supplier risk because of what you're buying, then that's when you can start doing assessments on multiple dimensions and taking that all into account when you're determining what the risk actually, and that's, if you go look at, for example, financial regulations in the States, there's pages and pages and pages and pages of guidance from financial regulators like the OCC, for example, that tells you how to go about doing that. So that's just a quick, if you want to go and dig deeper into that, as a place that's always good to start. Now, I know we got to wrap up. Now, before we do, I do just want to say that we referenced the Economist Impact survey, kind of throughout the conversation. It's a really kind of interesting report that goes into this topic in a lot more details. So I'd recommend, if anybody would like to go and download that report, there's no email required or anything like that. We just made an easy link there. It's called Shifting Gears, Procurement Refocuses on Risk and Sustainability. You can just go to artofprocurement.com/SAP-risk. That will take you directly to the report. So I encourage everybody to go and do that. With that said, Gordon, thank you for staying up so late or so early, depending on your outlook, this morning, for participating in today's AOP Live. And Matt as well, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, with that said, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Kelly, thank you for keeping an eye on those questions. And we will be back soon with another AOP Live. So until next time, take care, everybody, and thank you.